The afternoon the bracelet surfaced, everything changed. Not slowly, not with warning, not in the way that change usually announces itself, with small signs that you only recognize in retrospect. It changed the way the water changed when he dove into it. All at once, completely, with no possibility of returning to the surface the same person who had left it. But that came later. First, there was the pool. The Emerald Crown Resort sat on the edge of Victoria Island, like something that had decided the rest of Lagos was not its concern. 40 acres of manicured grounds, a private marina, 2 restaurants that required reservations 3 weeks in advance, and a swimming complex that occupied a full quarter of the property. 3 connected pools of graduated depth, edged in pale stone, surrounded by cabanas and imported lounge furniture that was replaced every season, whether it needed to be or not. The kind of place where the water was always exactly the right temperature and the staff anticipated what you needed before you formed the thought. On the first Saturday of November, the resort hosted the annual Technology and Innovation Gala, organized by Okafor Integrated Systems, one of West Africa's most significant technology holding companies, with interests in fintech, telecommunications infrastructure, and digital logistics across 11 countries. The gala drew 400 guests, business leaders from Lagos, Abuja, Accra, Nairobi, investors from London and Dubai who flew in for the weekend specifically, government officials who came for the visibility and stayed for the food, journalists who came for both. At the center of all of it, as he had been at the center of most things in this industry for the past 8 years, was Emeka Okafor. He was 34 years old, 6'1", the kind of man who entered a room and caused a subtle, involuntary recalibration in the people already there. Not because he demanded attention, but because he carried the specific gravity of someone who had built something real and knew exactly what it had cost. He had founded Okafor Integrated at 26, with seed funding, a rented office in Yaba, and a team of 4 engineers who believed in his vision before there was evidence to justify the belief. 8 years later, the company employed 3,000 people across 7 countries and had been valued, at its most recent funding round, at a number that financial journalists reached for superlatives to describe. He stood near the edge of the main pool terrace, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, watching the late afternoon light move across the water. Beside him, his head of legal and his oldest friend, Chukwudi Eze, was saying something about the evening's program that Emeka was only partially processing. "You're doing it again," Chukwudi said. Emeka looked at him. "What?" "Looking somewhere else while I'm talking to you." Chukwudi adjusted his jacket. "I have been telling you about the keynote arrangement for 3 minutes. You have not heard a word." "I heard the first word." "Which was?" Emeka considered. The Chukwudi sighed. "You need to be on stage in 40 minutes. "I know." He looked back at the pool. Something was pulling at him that he could not name. A restlessness that had been sitting in his chest for weeks. Quiet, but persistent. The way certain problems sit before they become urgent. He had been asked recently by a journalist, in a profile interview that had run in a Lagos business magazine, what he was still working toward. He had given a considered, articulate answer about market expansion and technological infrastructure. The journalist had printed it. He had read it afterward and thought, "That is a complete answer, and it does not describe what I am actually working toward." He was not sure what he was actually working toward. Chukwudi's phone rang. He stepped away to answer it. Emeka stood at the pool edge alone, watching the water, and then the sound came. Not a shout, a single sharp cry, cut short, and then silence, and then the particular thrashing sound of someone who is losing the fight against water. Not swimming, not playing, but fighting, with the specific, desperate energy of a person who understands they are running out of time. He saw her immediately. She was in the deep section of the center pool, near the far edge, where the water was 3 meters at its lowest point. She had gone under once. She came up briefly, her arms reaching in the direction of the pool edge that was 4 meters away, and then the arms lost coordination and she went under again. Emeka's jacket hit the ground. He was running before any conscious decision had been made. He dove. The water received him cleanly. He moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had swum competitively through secondary school and university, and had kept it as a discipline in the years after, not for recreation, but because some habits, once built into the body, stay there. He reached the surface of the deep section in 5 strokes and went under immediately, eyes open, searching. She was sinking. Her hair fanned out around her head in the water. Her eyes were closed. Her movements had slowed to the barely there motion of a body that had stopped fighting and was simply present in the water, going where the water took it. He reached her in 3 seconds. His arm went around her waist. He kicked for the surface with everything he had, the weight of her body against his arm, the resistance of the water, the distance that felt longer going up than it had going down. They broke the surface. The crowd at the pool edge erupted, sound rushing back in after the underwater silence. Voices, someone calling for the resort medic, the specific collective gasp of 400 people releasing a breath they had been holding. He held her at the surface, turning her so her face was clear of the water, and he moved toward the pool steps because the edge was too high to lift her directly. At the steps, 2 resort staff members were already there, and Chukwudi was there, and between them, they got her out of the water and onto the pale stone surface beside the pool. She was not breathing. Emeka came out of the pool and dropped to his knees beside her, without pausing to think about it. He had done a first aid certification 3 years ago, not for any professional reason, simply because he believed that people in positions of responsibility should know basic emergency response. He had renewed it once. The mechanics were in him. He began compressions. The crowd pressed close, and then back, as the resort medic arrived, a composed woman in a white uniform who took over smoothly and without drama, and Emeka moved aside and sat back on his heels and watched her work and did not look away. 20 seconds. 30. Then the girl coughed. The sound was rough and sudden, and the crowd responded to it with the specific release of a large group of people who have been collectively holding tension. Several people exhaled audibly. Someone said something under their breath that might have been relief or prayer. A woman near the back began crying. The girl coughed again, and her eyes opened. They were dark brown, very dark, the kind of eyes that, even in the confused, disoriented moment of returning from unconsciousness, held a quality of attention, a presence, as if some part of her was always paying close attention to what was in front of her, regardless of the circumstances. She looked at the sky first, then at the medic crouching over her, then, slightly to the left, at Emeka. He was still on one knee beside her. His suit was soaked through. Water was running off his jacket onto the pale stone. He was not thinking about any of this. He was looking at her face and experiencing something that he could not immediately classify, a sense of recognition without a corresponding memory, like hearing a piece of music that you know you have heard before but cannot place, cannot name the occasion, cannot say when or where, only that it exists somewhere in you already. "Can you hear me?" he asked. His voice came out quieter than he expected. She blinked. Yes. Her voice was rough from the water, barely above a whisper. "What's your name?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Adaize. Adaize Mensa." The name settled into the air between them. He said, "Emeka, don't try to sit up yet." She did not sit up. She looked at him with those very dark, very present eyes, and something in the look had the quality of someone trying to place a face they cannot quite locate in memory. The medic gently moved Emeka aside to complete her assessment. He stood. Chukwudi appeared beside him immediately, jacket in hand, phone already out. He said quietly, "She okay?" Emeka said, "She will be." Chukwudi looked at him with the specific attention of someone who knows a person very well and is currently reading something new in their face. He said nothing about it, but he noted it. It was when the medic was helping Adaize sit up, 15 minutes later, that it happened. The motion of sitting caused something to slip from beneath the sleeve of the thin dress, Adeze was wearing. A bracelet. Simple, silver, the kind of piece that did not announce itself, but had a quality of age to it. Not antique exactly, but worn in the specific way of something that has been present on a person's wrist for a long time and has absorbed that presence. The afternoon light caught it as it fell against her wrist. Emeka saw it, and something inside him moved. Not the vague, unclassifiable recognition he had felt looking at her face. Something sharper than that, something specific, a flash of an image. A hospital room, white walls, fluorescent light. A woman's hand pressed into his much smaller hand, and on that woman's wrist, catching the fluorescent light, a silver bracelet exactly like this one. The image was gone in less than a second. He was left standing at the pool edge in a soaked suit with the specific disorientation of someone who has just had a memory surface from a depth they did not know it was stored at. His mother. The bracelet had belonged to his mother. He was certain of this, with a certainty that he could not support with any conscious recall. He had been 4 years old when his mother died, and the memories he retained from that age were fragmentary at best, impressionistic, the kind of memories that are more feeling than image. But the feeling attached to the bracelet was unmistakable. The feeling was her. How could this girl, this stranger, be wearing his mother's bracelet? He looked at Adeze. She was speaking quietly to the medic, answering questions about whether she felt any pain, whether she had eaten, whether she had any medical conditions. She looked young, 18, he estimated, perhaps 19. She was calm in the way of someone who has processed the shock of a frightening experience and is now in the practical phase of recovery. He looked at the bracelet again, then at her face, then at the bracelet. The feeling did not diminish. Chukwudi appeared at his elbow. "The keynote," he said quietly. 20 minutes, Emeka said. "Find out who she is." Chukwudi looked at him. "The girl? Find out her full name, where she's from, how she got into the event. Gently, through the resort staff, not through our security team. It should not feel like an investigation." Chukwudi looked at him for a moment with the expression he reserved for situations that did not fit any existing category. Then he said, "Okay." He moved away. Emeka looked once more at Adeze, who was now accepting a towel from a resort staff member and saying something that made the young staff member smile despite the circumstances of the last 20 minutes, which told him something about the kind of person she was. Then he turned and walked toward the building to change for the keynote. The bracelet image stayed with him the entire way. He delivered the keynote on autopilot. Not badly. He was too practiced at this for it to be bad, and the content was substantive, the kind of talk that gave the audience something real to think about, rather than the motivational performance that passed for insight at many industry events. He talked about infrastructure, about the specific problems of building technology systems in environments where the foundational layers, power, connectivity, logistics, were inconsistent. He talked about what the next decade required from the people in the room. He talked about responsibility. The audience was engaged. He knew this from the quality of the silence while he was speaking. The focused, forward-leaning silence of people who are actually listening, as opposed to the polite, waiting silence of people who are enduring. But part of him was somewhere else. Part of him was standing at the pool edge, looking at a silver bracelet catch the afternoon light. After the keynote, during the networking portion of the evening, Chukwudi found him near the terrace entrance. He said, "Her name is Adeze Mensah, 18 years old. She's a first-year engineering student at the University of Lagos. She came to the event as a volunteer, through the university's partnership with the Gala Organizing Committee. She has been here since 7 this morning, helping with setup." Emeka absorbed this. He said, "She's a student." Chukwudi said, "Engineering, first year." Apparently she was one of 3 students specifically requested by the organizing team because of her technical background. He paused. The pool, she didn't know that section was out of bounds. A barrier rope had been removed for cleaning and not replaced. Resort management has already acknowledged it was their fault. Emeka said, "Is she still here?" She's in the medical room. The medic wanted to monitor her for an hour before clearing her to leave. He said, I want to speak with her. Before she goes. Chukwudi looked at him again with the expression. Emeka said, the bracelet on her wrist. I need to ask her about it. Chukwudi said, the bracelet. Yes. Chukwudi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Emeka, she's 18. I am aware of that. This is not what you are thinking. He met his friend's eyes. The bracelet. I have seen it before. Somewhere in my memory, and it connects to my mother. I cannot explain it more clearly than that, because I do not have more clarity than that. But I need to understand it. Chukwudi studied him for a long moment. Then he said, medical room is on the ground floor, east wing. Emeka straightened his jacket. A dry one. His assistant had produced a replacement from his car and walked toward the east wing. Adaeze was sitting on a low bed in the medical room, wrapped in a resort robe, her wet dress folded neatly on the chair beside her. The medic was completing paperwork at the desk. Adaeze was looking at her phone, which had somehow survived the pool in the pocket of her dress. She had discovered this with the specific relief of someone for whom replacing a phone was not a casual expense. She looked up when Emeka entered. He said, I hope I'm not intruding, she said. You're the person who pulled me out of the water, he said. Yes, she said. Then you're allowed to intrude. She said it simply, not with the wide-eyed, performed gratitude that he might have expected from someone meeting him in the professional context of the event. Just directly. As a fact, he sat in the chair across from her, which the medic indicated was acceptable. He said, How are you feeling? She said, Embarrassed. And fine. Those are not the same thing, but they are both true. He said, You don't need to be embarrassed. The barrier rope, she said. I know. They told me. She paused. It doesn't make it less embarrassing to have been the person in the water, while 400 people watched. He understood this. He did not argue with it. He said, Can I ask you something that may seem like an unusual question? She looked at him. The dark, attentive eyes. Go ahead, he said. The bracelet on your wrist. Where did it come from? She looked at her wrist immediately, the reflex of someone checking that something important is still there. The bracelet was there. She touched it. She said, My mother gave it to me. He said, Do you know where she got it? She looked at him with the specific look of someone assessing the intent behind a question before deciding how much to say. She said, She has had it as long as I can remember. She never really explained it. She always said she would tell me the story one day. He said, And has she? She said, Not yet. She was going to. She stopped. She looked at him more carefully. Why are you asking about my bracelet? He said. Because I believe I have seen it before. Or one exactly like it. He paused. It may sound strange. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, Everything about today is strange. That doesn't make it untrue. He almost smiled at that. He said, My mother died when I was 4. I don't have many clear memories of her. But when I saw the bracelet, when the light hit it as you were sitting up, something surfaced. A memory, or the shape of one. A hospital room, her hand, and the bracelet. The room was quiet. Adaeze looked at her wrist again, then at him. She said, What was your mother's name? He said, Ngozi Okafor. Something shifted in Adaeze's face, not dramatically. A slight, involuntary change. The specific expression of someone who has just heard a word that connects to something they were not expecting to connect to. She said, Okafor. He said, Yes. She looked at the bracelet for a long moment. Then she said quietly, I think I need to call my mother. She said it with the particular tone of someone who has just understood that a conversation they have been waiting for, the story their mother always promised to tell them one day, may have just arrived, unexpectedly, on a Saturday evening in a hotel medical room, in the form of a man who pulled them out of a swimming pool. Emeka sat in the chair across from her and felt the specific sensation of standing at the edge of something large without being able to see its full shape yet. He said, Take your time. She picked up her phone. Her hands, he noticed, were very steady. Across the city, in a modest apartment in Surulere that was clean and organized in the specific way of homes where everything is considered before it is kept, Chioma Mensah was finishing the evening dishes when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. "Adaize," she answered immediately. "Adaize, what time are you coming home?" "The event should be, Mom." Adaize's voice was calm, but had a quality to it that Chioma recognized the way mothers recognize things, not from the words, but from the frequency beneath them. "Something has happened." Chioma set down the dish. "What kind of something?" There was a pause. Then Adaize said, "Mom, the bracelet, the one you gave me. I need you to tell me where it came from." The dishcloth fell from Chioma's hand. She did not reach to pick it up. She stood very still in her kitchen, with the evening sounds of Surulere coming through the window, traffic, a neighbor's television, children in the compound, and she felt something she had not felt in 20 years, the sensation of the past, which she had spent 2 decades carefully keeping in the past. Taking a single deliberate step forward, she said, "Why are you asking now?" Adaize said, "Because a man asked me about it. A man who says he thinks he has seen it before. A man whose mother's name was Ngozi Okafor." Silence. The kind of silence that is not empty but full. Full of everything that has been not said for 20 years. All of it suddenly taking up space in the kitchen in Surulere on a Saturday evening. Chioma closed her eyes. She said, very quietly, "Is he there with you?" Adaize said, "He's right here." Another silence. Then Chioma said, "Put him on." Adaize looked across the room at Emeka. She said, "My mother wants to speak with you." He looked at the phone she was extending toward him. He took it. He said, "Mrs. Mensah, my name is Emeka Okafor." The pause that followed lasted 4 seconds. Then a woman's voice said, in a tone that contained 20 years of something in it, "I know who you are. I have always known who you would become." She stopped. "I just never knew this day would come like this." Emeka felt something shift inside him. Deep, fundamental. He said, "I think we need to meet." She said, "Yes, we do." Her voice was steady, but thin at the edges, the way a voice sounds when the person speaking is keeping it together by conscious effort. She said, "I have something to tell you that belongs to you. I should have found a way to tell you years ago. I am sorry it took a swimming pool." He said, "Tomorrow, wherever is easiest for you, I will come to you." She said, "Come in the morning. Come for breakfast." She paused. "There is a letter that goes with all of this. A letter that has been waiting 20 years to reach you." He said, "I'll be there." He handed the phone back to Adaize. She took it and stepped out of the room to finish speaking with her mother. He sat alone in the medical room. The resort sounds moved around him, distant music from the gala still in progress, the subdued efficiency of a hotel evening, the ordinary noise of a large building going about its business. He sat in it and thought about the bracelet. He thought about his mother, about the 4 years he had had with her and the 30 years he had carried her absence. He thought about the hospital memory that had surfaced at the pool edge, the image that had arrived in less than a second and had not left since. He thought about the specific feeling that had accompanied looking at Adaize's face when she first opened her eyes. Recognition without memory. Connection without explanation. He thought, perhaps explanation has been sitting in an apartment in Surulere for 20 years. Perhaps tomorrow morning, explanation will finally arrive. He sat with this. The gala continued outside. The pool was still. And somewhere in the east wing of the Emerald Crown Resort, an 18-year-old engineering student stood in a corridor speaking to her mother. And in the silences between what they said, both of them could feel the shape of something large and long buried, preparing to come fully into the light. This was not because of the pool. Her body had recovered quickly, the way young bodies recover from shock, with a thoroughness that older bodies eventually stop managing. By the time she reached home that night, the physical experience of the afternoon had already begun receding into the specific category of things that happened and were frightening and were over. Her lungs felt normal. Her hands were steady. The medic had cleared her without qualification. What kept her awake was the phone call. She lay in the narrow bed in her room in the Sur-Alaire apartment and stared at the ceiling and replayed the conversation. Not her own words, but her mother's. The specific quality of the silence that had followed Adieze, saying the name Okafor. She had heard her mother go quiet in many ways over the years. Quiet because she was tired. Quiet because she was thinking. Quiet because something on the television had moved her. This silence had been different from all of those. This silence had the density of something that had been compressed for a very long time and had just been given permission to expand. I know who you are. I have always known who you would become. Those were not the words of a stranger. They were the words of someone who had been watching from a distance for 20 years. Adieze turned to face the wall. The bracelet was on the small table beside her bed. She had taken it off for the first time in months, which she never did, because she could not stop looking at it, and she needed to stop looking at it if she was going to sleep at all. In the thin light coming under her door from the corridor, she could see its outline. Simple, silver, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what she now suspected it carried. She heard her mother moving in the kitchen around midnight, not cooking, just moving, the way Chioma moved when something was keeping her awake, and she had decided that the kitchen was the appropriate location for working through it. Adieze considered getting up. She decided against it. Whatever her mother was processing at midnight, it was old and it was hers, and it needed to be hers for a few more hours before it became shared. She closed her eyes. She thought about Emeka Okafor's face when he had looked at the bracelet. She had watched that look happen in real time, the way his expression had changed from the focused, practical attention of someone managing a medical situation to something much more internal, something private. He had not performed it. It had simply arrived on his face, uninvited, the way real reactions arrive when a person is not managing them. That was the thing about the afternoon, she thought. None of it had felt performed. Not his dive into the water, not the compressions, not the way he had sat with her in the medical room and asked his question carefully, as if he understood that the answer might matter and wanted to approach it with the respect that mattered things deserved. She had met important people before. At the university, through the gala organizing committee, at various events where her academic results had opened doors that her family's financial position would not have. She had learned to recognize the specific performance that important people sometimes deployed. The way they leaned forward to signal interest. 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 He had not done any of that. He had sat in a chair in a hotel medical room in a replacement jacket and asked her about a bracelet with the directness of someone who genuinely needed to know. She pulled the blanket up. Tomorrow morning he was coming to their apartment. The thought sat in her chest with a weight that was not exactly anxiety and not exactly anticipation, but something that combined elements of both in a proportion she could not quite determine. She slept eventually, lightly. Chioma was up before 5. She had not slept at all, which was something she had not done, stayed entirely awake through a full night since the year Adieze was born, when new mother alertness had rewired her sleep patterns for months. That year she had learned that there was a particular kind of wakefulness that was not insomnia but vigil, staying awake because something required your full attention, because sleep felt like an abandonment of something that needed to be kept company. Tonight she kept company with a wooden box she had taken from the top shelf of her wardrobe. The box was not large, teak, old, with a brass clasp that had gone slightly green at the edges from 20 years of storage. She had not opened it in 4 years. Before that, she had opened it occasionally, Once a year, sometimes less. The way you check on something important to confirm it is still there. She had never taken anything out of it. She had only looked. Tonight she took everything out. She spread it on the kitchen table carefully. Photographs, documents, a folded newspaper clipping from a business publication, an early profile of Emeka Okafor, published when Okafor Integrated was 5 years old and beginning to attract serious attention, the kind of profile that ran with a photograph. She had seen that photograph and recognized the jaw, the set of the eyes, the particular quality of focus in the face that she remembered from a different face in a different context 20 years before. She had cut the article out and put it in the box and not looked at it again. There was a letter. She placed it on the table last. It was sealed still. She had never opened it because it was not addressed to her. It was addressed, in handwriting that she had spent 20 years making sure she would not forget, to the son. No name, because the name had not yet been decided when it was written. Just, for my son, when the time comes. Ngozi Okafor had written it in the hospital, during her recovery, 11 days before she was discharged. She had pressed it into Chioma's hands on the morning she left with the specific insistence of a woman who understood that she was managing something against a deadline she could feel but could not name. "Keep this," Ngozi had said. "If I am not around to give it to him myself, find a way. Promise me." Chioma had promised. She had kept the promise imperfectly. She had kept the letter. She had kept the box. She had kept the secret of what she had done during those 48 hours in the emergency department of Lagos University Teaching Hospital 20 years ago, on the night a woman was brought in from a road accident, pregnant, bleeding, and given a survival prognosis that 2 senior doctors in the department had expressed, quietly and professionally, as poor. She had not kept the other part of the promise, which was the finding a way. She had told herself, over the years, various things about this. That Emeka Okafor was being raised by his father's family, that he was provided for, that the letter contained private family information that might confuse more than it clarified, that the time had never been right. None of these things were entirely false. All of them together did not add up to a sufficient justification, and she had known this while believing them. The truth was simpler and less flattering. She had been afraid of what it would mean to appear in the life of an increasingly prominent man with a box of documents and a story he had not asked for. Afraid of being misunderstood. Afraid, underneath all of it, that the letter contained something that would change Emeka Okafor's understanding of something important, and that she would be responsible for that change without having any control over how it landed. Fear was a more effective silencer than distance or time. Now he was coming to her kitchen in a few hours, and the silence was over. She made tea. She sat with the box open in front of her, and the letter in the center of the table, and the tea going slowly cold beside her. And she thought about what she was going to say, and how she was going to say it. And she thought about Adeze sleeping in the next room with the bracelet on the small bedside table. And she thought about a Saturday afternoon 20 years ago, when she had been 28 years old, and terrified, and the only person in a chaotic emergency department who had refused to accept the prognosis being offered. She had not been a hero that night. She had simply been unable to stop. Something in her had decided, with a clarity that bypassed the usual calculations, that stopping was not possible while there was still something to try. She had stayed for 48 hours, going home only to shower and change. And she had found the specialist they needed through a combination of professional contacts and stubborn phone calls. And she had advocated in the specific, unrelenting way of someone who does not have authority, but has conviction, and has decided that conviction will have to be enough. It had been enough. Barely. But enough. She poured the cold tea down the sink and made fresh. The city outside was beginning to stir. The first generator starting up somewhere in the compound. The sound of early morning traffic on the road. A rooster from the building 2 streets over that someone had been keeping in violation of estate rules for the past 3 years. Ordinary Sunday sounds. An extraordinary Sunday coming. Emeka arrived at 8:15. He had driven himself, which Adaeze noted when she looked out the window and saw a clean but unremarkable car park outside the compound. Not the kind of car she associated with the image of him she had seen in print, but ordinary in the deliberate way of someone who had made a choice about how to arrive for this particular visit. He was in plain clothes, dark trousers, a simple shirt. He looked, she thought, more like himself than he had looked the previous evening in the gala jacket. She opened the compound gate before he reached it. They looked at each other for a moment in the morning light. In the daylight, away from the pool and the shock and the hotel environment, he looked different, not lesser, but more specific. Tired around the eyes in a way that told her he had also not slept well. He said, "Good morning. Are you all right?" She said, "Better than yesterday. Come in." She led him up the 2 flights to the apartment. The stairwell smelled of the compound's morning, cooking from the ground floor flat, the specific smell of concrete and old paint, and the faint trace of the cleaning product the caretaker used on the stairs every Sunday. She opened the apartment door. Her mother was in the kitchen. Chioma turned when they came in. She was a small woman, shorter than Adaeze had always realized mothers looked beside their adult children, which was a thing that surprised Adaeze anew each time she noticed it. She was wearing a simple house dress. Her hair was wrapped. She looked, in this moment, exactly like what she was, a woman in her late 40s who had been awake all night and was managing that fact with the specific composure of someone who has decided that composure is what this moment requires. She looked at Emeka for a long time. He looked back at her. Adaeze watched them look at each other and felt something she could not name, a sense of 2 timelines converging, of something that had been moving toward this point for longer than she had been alive. Chioma said, "You look like her." Her voice was steady. She had clearly decided how she was going to begin. Emeka said, "People have said that." "Not often. Usually people compare me to my father," Chioma said. "Your mother's eyes, the way you hold your head." She paused. "I would have recognized you anywhere." She stepped aside from the kitchen doorway. "Please sit down. I made breakfast." They sat at the kitchen table. The wooden box was on the counter behind Chioma, closed. The table had been set with the particular care of someone for whom feeding people was an expression of things that words could not quite reach. Jollof rice, that had been made that morning, despite the hour and the circumstances. Fried plantain, eggs, a pot of tea. Emeka looked at the food and then at Chioma and said, simply, "Thank you for this." She said, "You came to my home. People who come to my home eat." He almost smiled. Adaji poured the tea. The 3 of them ate for a few minutes in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was preparatory. The silence of people who understand that a significant conversation is about to happen and are giving it the space of a few minutes of ordinary activity before it begins. Then Chioma set down her fork. She stood. She brought the wooden box to the table and placed it between them and sat back down. She did not open it immediately. She said, 20 years ago, I was a nurse at Lagos University Teaching Hospital. I had been working there for 3 years. I was still learning more than I was confident about, which is the condition of the 3rd year of any serious work." She paused. One night in November, a woman was brought in from a road accident. She had been hit by a tanker on the expressway. She was pregnant, 8 months. She was losing blood rapidly, and her vitals were deteriorating. The on-call team worked on her immediately. 2 of the senior doctors, after the first assessment, took the view that the prognosis was very poor, that we might lose both the mother and the child. She stopped. She looked at the box. Emeka had put down his fork. He was watching her with complete stillness. Chioma continued, "I was a junior nurse. It was not my place to argue with senior doctors." She said it plainly, not as an excuse, as a statement of the institutional reality she had been operating in. But I could not accept the assessment. Something in me, she paused, searching for the right word. Something in me simply refused to stop while there was anything left to try. I spent the next 48 hours finding a specialist we did not have on staff, a vascular surgeon who could manage the specific complication she was experiencing. I made calls I did not technically have the authority to make. I went around protocols I was probably not supposed to go around. Adaize was very still. Chioma said, "The surgeon came." The operation was long and complicated, but the woman survived, and so did her son. She looked at Emeka directly. Her name was Ngozi Okafor. You were the son. The kitchen was completely quiet. Outside, the compound was making its Sunday sounds, the generator, the neighbor's radio, a child being called somewhere below. None of it reached the table. Emeka said nothing for a long moment. His face was completely still, but his eyes were moving, reading something, processing something, reorganizing an understanding that had held one shape for 30 years and was now being asked to hold a different one. Then he said, "You saved her life," Chioma said. "I refuse to stop trying. There is a difference, and it matters to me that you understand the difference." He looked at her. He said, "Why does the difference matter to you?" She said, "Because I am not telling you this so that you will be grateful to me. I am telling you because it is the truth, and because the truth belongs to you. It has always belonged to you." He was quiet again. Then he said, "The bracelet." She nodded. She reached into the pocket of her house dress and placed the bracelet on the table beside the box. Not Adaize's bracelet, another one, identical. The same silver, the same age, the same quality of having been worn for a long time. She said, "Before your mother was discharged, she gave me 2 things. The bracelet, she bought a pair of them in the weeks she spent recovering. 2 identical ones. She said they were for remembering. She kept one. She gave me the other, and she gave me a letter." She opened the box. She took out the letter, still sealed. She placed it on the table in front of Emeka. "For my son, when the time comes." His handwriting recognition was not possible. He had been 4 years old when she died, too young to have memories of her handwriting. But he looked at the words on the envelope with the expression of someone receiving something they did not know they had been waiting for. He touched the edge of the envelope with one finger. He did not pick it up immediately. He said, "She told you to give this to me." Chioma said, "She made me promise, and I kept the promise imperfectly." She said it without flinching. "I kept the letter. I kept the bracelet and gave it to Adaize when she was old enough to wear it. But I did not find a way to reach you as I promised I would. I have reasons for that. None of them are reasons I am proud of when I look at them clearly." He said, "Why are you telling me now?" She said, "Because yesterday your life and my daughter's life crossed in a way that made the silence no longer possible. And because I have been sitting in this kitchen since midnight, understanding that keeping the truth from you was a form of taking something that did not belong to me." She paused. "I owe you this. I should have found a way to give it to you years ago." The kitchen was quiet again. Adaize had been watching her mother's face during all of this, and seeing things in it she had not seen before. Not new qualities, but familiar ones in an unfamiliar configuration. She knew her mother as organized, disciplined, practical, loving in the specific way of someone who expressed love through action rather than declaration. She had not known her mother as someone carrying 20 years of a complicated promise. She had not known, until this moment, that the silence her mother sometimes carried had this particular shape. Emeka picked up the letter. He held it for a moment. He said, "May I read it here?" Chioma said, "This is your letter. You can read it wherever you choose." He broke the seal. The paper inside was old, not fragile, but with the specific texture of paper that has been stored carefully for a long time. The handwriting was clear. A woman's hand, unhurried, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had decided exactly what they wanted to say and was taking the time to say it properly. He read. Adaize watched his face while he read and saw things move through it that she did not have names for. Not emotions she could label, but something more fundamental than labeled emotions, the specific movement of a person's understanding of themselves shifting at the ground level. He read for several minutes. When he finished, he placed the letter carefully on the table. He did not speak immediately. Chioma waited. She had waited 20 years. She could wait 5 more minutes. Then Emeka said, "She wrote about the night of the accident, about what she heard the doctors say, and about watching a junior nurse refuse to accept what the senior doctors had decided." She said. His voice was very even. The evenness of someone managing something large by keeping his voice very controlled. She said that in her worst moment, the person who refused to give up on her was a stranger who had no obligation to fight for her. She said she spent the rest of her life trying to understand what kind of person does that. He stopped. Then he said, "She never found out your name." Chioma said, "We lost touch after she was discharged. I transferred hospitals the following year. I never found a way to reach her." He said, "She wrote," he paused, looking at the letter. "She wrote that she hoped her son would find the woman with the bracelet someday. She said the bracelet was her way of making sure there was something to find, something that could connect. The bracelet on Adaizi's table in the next room, the bracelet on the counter beside the box. 2 identical pieces of silver, sent out into the world 20 years ago by a woman who understood that she might not be around to complete the connection herself, and had done what she could to make it possible anyway." Adaize felt something in her chest that she could not immediately speak around. Chioma said, quietly. "She was a remarkable woman," he said. "I know. I had 4 years with her. They were enough to know that." Another silence. Then Emeka said something that surprised Adaize by its directness. "Why did you give the bracelet to Adaize?" Chioma looked at her daughter, then back at him. She said, "Because it was not mine to keep, and I was not ready to give it to its real owner. Giving it to Adaize was a way of keeping it in the family, of honoring where it came from without doing the harder thing of finding you." She paused. "It was not the right decision, but it is the honest one." He looked at Adaize. She met his eyes across the kitchen table, the same dark, present eyes that had looked up at him from the pool's edge the previous afternoon, except that now they contained the specific weight of someone who has just learned that the object they have worn on their wrist for years has a history they were never told, a history that runs directly through the man sitting across from them. He said, "I am sorry you did not know." She said, "My mother's reasons were her own." She paused. "But I think I am glad I did not know. If I had known, the bracelet would have felt different on my wrist, like something I was carrying for someone else." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I know the whole story. That's different from knowing only part of it." She looked at the bracelet on the counter. "I think it still belongs on a wrist, just with the full story attached." He looked at the bracelet on the counter. He looked at the one in the letter's description. He looked at his mother's handwriting on the page in front of him. He said, "She would have liked you." Adase blinked. She was not entirely prepared for that. Chioma, watching this exchange with the careful attention of a mother reading a situation she has not fully anticipated, made a decision that expressed itself as standing up and collecting the tea things with the specific purposeful movement of someone who has decided to give 2 other people a few minutes without an audience. She went to the kitchen counter. Emeka and Adaize sat at the table with the letter and the box and the bracelet between them, and the morning light coming through the kitchen window at the angle it came through on Sunday mornings in this apartment, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Adaize said, "You came here this morning, not knowing what you were going to find." He said, "I came here this morning, knowing I needed to understand something. The specifics were not predictable." She said, "And do you understand it now?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "More than I did yesterday. Not completely." He looked at the letter. "There are things here, things she wrote, that I am going to need time to sit with." She nodded. That made sense to her entirely. She said, "Will you tell me what she wrote? If you want to. You don't have to." He looked at the letter, then at her. He said, "She wrote about the night she almost died, about what it felt like to survive something that the doctors did not expect her to survive. She wrote that the experience changed her understanding of how lives are connected, that the connections we do not choose, the ones that arrive without our planning, are often the ones that carry the most weight. Adayeze said nothing. He said, "She wrote that she hoped, if the bracelet ever found its way back, that whoever carried it would understand it as what she intended it to be, not a debt, not an obligation, just proof that something happened, that a stranger stayed when she did not have to, that it mattered." Chioma, at the kitchen counter, did not turn around, but her hands stopped moving for a moment. Then she resumed, and the sound of the cup being placed on the counter was the only sound in the apartment. Outside, the Sunday continued. Ordinary, unaware, the city going about its weekend in the specific way Lagos went about weekends, which was to say, not particularly restfully, but with a slightly different energy than the weekday noise. The compound below was filling with the sounds of people beginning their day. Inside the kitchen, 3 people sat with something that had taken 20 years to reach this room, and the reaching had happened because of a swimming pool and a bracelet catching afternoon light, and a man who had noticed and not let the noticing go. Adayeze reached across the table and picked up her bracelet, the one from her bedroom that she had brought to the kitchen earlier, before Emeka arrived, without quite knowing why. She held it in her palm. She looked at it the way she would always look at it differently now. She said, "What do we do with all of this?" It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, and she directed it at both her mother and at him equally. Chioma turned from the counter. Emeka looked at the table. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor in the way it moved in this apartment at this hour, slowly, without hurry. Then Emeka said, "I think we start by having breakfast." He looked at the table, the jollof rice, the plantain, the eggs that had been sitting waiting through everything. "Then we figure out the rest." Chioma sat back down. Adayeze set the bracelet beside the letter on the table. And for the first time since the previous afternoon, something in all 3 of them settled. Not resolved, not finished, but settled in the way of people who have finally arrived at the place a long journey was always moving toward, and have recognized it as such. The food was still warm. They ate. But not everything had settled, because 40 minutes later, while Emeka was in the living room reviewing his mother's letter again, and Adayeze was clearing the table, and Chioma was in the kitchen, Adayeze's phone rang. A number she did not recognize. She answered. A voice, female, composed, with the specific smoothness of someone who had trained themselves to sound comfortable in every situation, said, "Adayeze Mensa?" She said, "Yes." "Who is this?" The voice said, "My name is not important yet. What is important is that you are very close to becoming involved in something that you do not fully understand." She paused. "The man in your apartment right now, there are people who would prefer he does not learn what is in that letter." Adayeze's hand tightened on the phone. She said, "What people?" The voice said, "The kind of people who have spent 20 years making sure certain things stayed buried." She paused. "I am calling because I think you deserve to know that what happened at that pool yesterday was not entirely an accident." The line went dead. Adayeze stood in the kitchen doorway holding her phone. In the living room, Emeka was reading his mother's letter, his face quiet and concentrated. Her mother was washing a cup at the sink, her back turned. The Sunday morning sounds of the compound came through the window, perfectly ordinary, completely indifferent to what had just been said into a phone. Adayeze looked at the phone in her hand. Then she looked at Emeka. Something that had felt, 5 minutes ago, like an arrival, a resolution, a completion of something long unfinished, had just revealed itself to be something else entirely, not an ending, a beginning of something she did not yet have the full shape of. And the question of what had really happened at the pool the previous afternoon had just become the most important question in the room. The call lasted 43 seconds. Adaweza's phone screen still glowed after she pulled it away from her ear. She sat at the kitchen table in Surulere, the same table where Chioma had placed the wooden box less than 2 hours ago, and she stared at the wall, as if the paint held an answer. Her mother was washing the breakfast dishes with her back turned. The sound of water running, cups clinking against the basin, the low hum of a neighbor's generator beyond the window, everything continued as though nothing had shifted. But something had. The voice on the phone had been male, low and precise, not hurried, not threatening in the way of films or street confrontations. Threatening in the way of someone who had rehearsed calm. The letter was not meant to leave that house. Make sure it stays where it is. That was all. No name, no number visible. It had come through as a withheld line. Adaiza placed the phone face down on the table. She thought about telling her mother immediately. Then she looked at Chioma's shoulders, still and steady as she worked through the dishes, and she decided to wait. Her mother had already carried this secret for 2 decades. Dropping another weight on her in the same morning felt unnecessary, at least until Adaiza understood what the weight actually was. Emeka was in the sitting room with the letter still in his hands. He had read it 3 times. Not because the words were difficult. They were straightforward. His mother had written with the same precision she apparently applied to everything. Short sentences, no ornamentation. Direct statements that landed like stepping stones across still water, each one requiring a pause before moving to the next. The letter read, "To my son. If you are reading this, then someone has kept a promise I had no right to ask for. I was in a car on the Apapa Bridge on a Wednesday evening in October. I was 7 months along. The car stopped moving, and I could not reach anyone. A young woman found me, stayed with me, and made sure I reached the hospital. She was not a doctor yet. She argued with people who outranked her, and she did not stop until I was stable. I never got her full name. I only had a first name, and I only knew she worked at St. Michael's. By the time I was discharged, she had transferred departments. I looked, but not hard enough. That is the truth. I left her the bracelet because it was the only valuable thing I had with me that night. I asked the ward sister to pass it along. I do not know if it arrived. I want you to find her if she is still there. Not to repay her. You cannot repay that kind of thing. But because she should know that what she did that night produced something, that it was not wasted. Show her you turned out well. That is all. Your mother." Emeka folded the letter carefully along its original crease lines and placed it on the center cushion beside him. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, and he looked at the floor tiles for a long time. His mother had died when he was 11. He had grown up with a version of her constructed from photographs, from what his father told him, from what relatives volunteered at gatherings. He knew her laugh from a home video recorded at a cousin's wedding. He knew her handwriting from birthday cards she had written before he was old enough to read them himself, cards his father had kept in a manila envelope in the wardrobe. He had not known this story. He had not known there was a Wednesday in October, a bridge, a young woman, an argument with senior staff, a ward sister, a bracelet. He had not known that the night he was born, his mother had nearly not made it to the hospital at all. Chioma came in from the kitchen, drying her hands on a cloth. She stood near the doorway, not sitting, giving him space. "She looked for you," Emeka said without turning his head. Chioma nodded. "I know. The ward sister told me someone had come asking. By then, I had moved to the pediatric ward. We kept missing each other. After a while, I thought maybe it was better to leave it. I was young. I did not want to make her feel obligated. She was not trying to create obligation. She was trying to close something. I understand that now." Adaiza appeared in the doorway behind her mother. She had been standing there for a moment already, listening. She caught Emeka's eye, and he looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her the night before at the pool. Not the controlled professional assessment of a man deciding whether a stranger needed medical attention. He looked at her the way people look at someone when they have just understood a connection they cannot yet fully explain. "The bracelet reached you," he said. Adaiza glanced at her wrist. "My mother gave it to me when I left for university. She said it had been with her through the hardest thing she had ever done, and that it would do the same for me. Emeka looked at Chioma. She was right about that. You were the hardest thing my mother ever did. A pause sat in the room. Not uncomfortable. The kind that means something has been properly acknowledged. Chioma pressed her lips together and looked at the window. When she turned back, her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. She nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they have been waiting a long time for something, and it has finally arrived exactly as they imagined it would. Adaiza did not tell Emeka about the phone call. Not yet. She needed to think. She needed to understand what the call meant before she handed it to someone else to interpret. She was 18. She was aware of how 18 felt to people in rooms like this, and she was not going to react before she had thought it through. She excused herself and went back to the kitchen. She filled a glass with water and stood at the counter and thought about the voice again. The letter was not meant to leave that house. Which house? The Okafor family home? The hospital? Some other location she was not yet aware of? If the letter had been kept in a box in her mother's possession for 20 years, then whoever had called knew the letter existed. They had known before this morning. That meant they had been watching, either her mother or Emeka or both, and waiting to see whether the connection would ever be made. That meant last night at the pool had been too convenient. She set the glass down. She was an engineering student. She understood systems. She understood that when two things happened close together, you did not assume coincidence until you had ruled out design. She went back to the sitting room. I need to tell you something, she said. Both Emeka and Chioma looked at her. She told them about the call. All 43 seconds of it, as accurately as she could reconstruct. The tone of the voice, the exact words, the withheld number, the timing. It had come through approximately 4 minutes after Emeka stepped into the sitting room with the letter. Chioma sat down immediately, as though her legs had simply decided the news required a chair. Emeka listened without expression. The stillness in his face was not shock. It was the stillness of someone who had encountered complicated things before and had learned not to perform a reaction before understanding what he was reacting to. Say the exact words again, he said. Adaiza repeated them. He nodded. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. Short, direct. Chukwudi. Are you still in Lagos? I need you at an address in Surulere. Write this down. He read out the street. Come alone. Do not tell anyone in the office where you are going. He ended the call and looked at Chioma. I am going to be honest with you. I do not know who that call came from. What I know is that calls like that are not usually random. Someone has known about this letter for long enough to have a contingency in place for exactly this moment. That takes preparation. Chioma looked at Adaiza. Her expression had the particular quality of a parent watching a child step into a space that is too large for comfort, but cannot be avoided. She has nothing to do with whatever this is, Chioma said, and her voice was firm in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. I know, Emeka said. I intend to make sure of that. Chukwudi arrived in 35 minutes. He was a compact, unhurried man in his late 40s who had worked as Emeka's head of security and logistics since Okafor Integrated Systems had 8 employees and 1 rented office in Ikeja. He came in, assessed the room, accepted a glass of water from Chioma, sat down, and listened. Emeka walked him through it from the beginning. The pool the night before, the bracelet, the morning visit, the letter, the phone call. Chukwudi did not ask unnecessary questions. When Emeka finished, he said, "The call matters less right now than the angle. Who benefits from the letter staying buried?" The room was quiet. "The letter connects my mother to this family," Emeka said. "It also confirms the timeline of my birth. I was born under conditions that were nearly fatal. My mother survived because of someone else's intervention. If that changes something about..." He stopped. He worked through it out loud. He owned a company worth a documented $340 million. His father had died 6 years ago. His father's estate had been divided between Emeka and 2 uncles, Bart Okafor and Namdi Okafor, according to a will that had been contested once and upheld. The basis of the contest had been a claim that a secondary clause in the will was improperly witnessed. The contest failed, but it had been expensive, and it had cost Emeka 2 years of legal wrangling, during which certain assets were frozen. "If my birth circumstances became public," he said slowly, "and if someone could argue they raised questions about the documentation surrounding that night." He shook his head. "I am not a lawyer, but I know what motivated the first challenge. It was not about the witnessing. It was about leverage." Chukwudi nodded. "Your Uncle Bart has been quiet for 4 years. That is not usually what ambitious men do. That is what men do when they are waiting." Chioma was watching this exchange with her hands folded in her lap. "This letter does not say anything unusual," she said. "It describes what happened. Your mother was in distress. I helped. You were born, that is all." "You are correct," Chukwudi said. "But correct does not always matter in the early stages of a legal challenge. What matters is whether introducing the letter creates enough uncertainty to reopen a conversation that was already closed." Adayeza had been listening from the edge of the room. She said, "So someone wants the letter destroyed before it becomes evidence in a case that has not started yet." 3 heads turned toward her. "She has a point," Chukwudi said. What followed took 3 weeks. Emeka did not return to his Victoria Island apartment during that time. He worked from a service apartment in Lekki, communicated with his legal team through Chukwudi, and met with Adayeza and Chioma twice more. Once to give them a written record of the letter's contents that his lawyers had formally received and timestamped, and once to tell them that Bart Okafor's legal team had made quiet inquiries with the probate registry about reopening the estate file. The inquiry was not a filing, it was a feeler. The kind of move made to test whether a door was still closed. The door was closed. Emeka's lawyers had anticipated it. The time-stamped record of the letter, combined with Chioma's formal witness statement about the events of that October night, corroborated by hospital records that his legal team subpoenaed with surprisingly little resistance, had preemptively closed the narrative. There was nothing ambiguous about the birth, nothing that could be twisted into leverage. The inquiry was withdrawn within 10 days. Emeka heard about it on a Tuesday afternoon. He was at his desk reviewing a supply chain restructure for the company's new Abuja branch. Chukwudi sent a single message. "It is done." He put his phone down and went back to the spreadsheet for 40 minutes. Then he closed the laptop, got up, and drove to Surulere. Chioma was at the market when he arrived. Adayeza opened the door still in her university reading clothes. Oversized t-shirt, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a highlighter in her hand. She looked at his face and understood immediately that it was over. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat at the kitchen table, the same table, the wooden box now back on the shelf in the next room, and she made him tea because she had noticed during the first visit that he drank tea in the afternoon rather than coffee, and she had simply remembered it without deciding to. He told her the full update. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Your uncle, what happens to him?" "Nothing, legally. He did not file. He made an inquiry and withdrew it. That is within his rights. But you know now. I knew before. I know more clearly now." He turned the mug in his hands. "Family is a complicated thing. I have not spoken to Bart in 4 years. I do not expect that to change. But I am not interested in a confrontation that has no productive end." Adayeza considered this. She was 18, and she found the restraint difficult to fully admire. She was still at the age where she believed confrontation was sometimes clarifying, sometimes necessary. But she also recognized that he was speaking from a position that had already absorbed the confrontation and come out on the other side, and that was a different thing. "My mother is going to want to know everything," she said. "I know. I will explain it to her when she is back. She will also want to return the bracelet. She has been thinking about it since the morning we read the letter." Emeka shook his head. "She should keep it. My mother gave it to her intentionally." That was the point. She will argue. "I know. She can argue. She should keep it." Adaiza almost smiled at that. She had not fully smiled in 3 weeks. It felt like something loosening slightly. Not relief exactly, more like the return of normal atmospheric pressure after something had been pressing down. Chioma came home to find Emeka at her kitchen table and her daughter across from him explaining, with the help of a hand-drawn diagram on the back of a printed assignment, how the supply chain restructure he had mentioned in passing was essentially the same problem as optimizing a distributed network for minimum latency. Chioma stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment watching this. Emeka was leaning forward, not explaining, listening, following the diagram with his eyes and asking a specific question about the routing logic at the third node. Adaiza was answering with the precision of someone who had thought about this for long enough that it had become instinct. Chioma set down her market bag quietly and went to put the kettle on. She did not interrupt. 3 months later, Adaiza sat in a seminar room at her university and presented a network optimization model to her second semester cohort. It was not extraordinary by the standards of the department. It was a solid first attempt, well-structured, with a clear methodology and a result that held up under the questions the lecturer asked. But in the acknowledgments section of the written submission, a section most students left blank because it was optional, she had written, "To my mother, who carried something for 20 years without knowing what it would eventually open." The lecturer read it. She did not comment on it in class, but she kept the copy. Emeka and Adaiza did not speak every day. They spoke when there was a reason to speak, which turned out to be more often than either of them had anticipated, because Adaiza kept encountering problems in her coursework that were structurally similar to problems Emeka had already solved in practice. And Emeka kept encountering decisions in the company that benefited from a perspective unconditioned by 12 years of industry habit. It was not dramatic. It was quiet and specific and useful in the way that genuine connection tends to be when it grows from something real rather than something performed. Chioma watched it with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has learned not to manage what does not need managing. She still wore the bracelet. The thing about secrets kept for 20 years is that they do not disappear quietly when they are finally told. They leave a shape behind, a visible place where something was missing, now filled. Sometimes the shape is painful. Sometimes it is simply clarifying. Sometimes, if the conditions are right and the people involved are honest enough to sit with the discomfort of what they did not know, the filling in can produce something that the secret itself never could. Emeka's mother had written a letter she was not sure would arrive. Chioma had kept a bracelet she was not sure she deserved. Adaiza had worn it for 3 years, not knowing that it was, in the most specific and literal sense, a message addressed to someone else, and that wearing it to a pool on a particular evening in Lagos would complete a delivery that had been in transit for 2 decades. None of them had planned any of it. That is perhaps the only honest thing you can say about it. No one planned it, and it happened anyway, and it was enough. If this story stayed with you, the bracelet, the letter, the 20 years of carrying something quietly, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you have ever held on to something for longer than you expected, waiting for the right moment to let it land, drop it in the comments. We read every one.